Good morning. My name is Blair Walker, and I'm the curator of Treasures from Elvira's Attic. So I'm going to show you the garments in the exhibit, give you some brief descriptions. The first garment is a wonderful cotton top that has a long bodice and very ornate sleeves. The trim is put on slightly on the diagonal, which was characteristic of the 1870s when I believe the jacket was made and worn. At that time they sometimes did things that were not balanced. They liked things that were a little bit offside. The next garment is a very, very beautiful blouse that has a lot of handmade lace. It's also got some machine-made lace, but up around the neck and on the shoulders, the whole yoke is hand-embroidered lace. And that's from the late 1900s, late 19th century, and probably was worn with a very long dress, long skirt. The next garment is a black satin jacket, a bodice, that has beautiful lace on a yoke, and then underneath, peeking through, and then also around the neck and down the front is some jet trim that has been embroidered and made into a curlicue kind of pattern. The buttons you can see also are jet, and it's quite gorgeous and elegant. It might have been worn with this parasol, which would have kept the sun off the lady's face, which was important. White complexions were very, very important. This garment is one of my favorites. It's a little bodice that has lantern sleeves and self-buttons, self-fabric, embroidered buttons. And what's really funny about it is that it has padding in the bust, which is not something you normally see. Very small garment. This is from the 1890s, about 1890. It's a white cotton bodice, or possibly, actually maybe it's silk, that's got machine embroidered dots on it, which have a little bit of fluff in the middle, and a lovely satin, brown satin skirt that it was worn with. Very long sleeves, and I think the sleeves may have been pushed up because I'm sure the woman's arms were not quite this long, but it is kind of a weird look. The next garment is earlier in the 19th century. This dress has what is called a fly front, and in fact it's pinned together. A lot of the time in the earlier part of the century they didn't have buttons, and they just used straight pins to keep their clothing together, which is of course scary when you think about how active people are. The collar is a separate collar. It's a Bertha collar, and underneath was just a very simple band collar. But this too was pinned on, and the whole front came apart and would be pinned to the side. That was a fly front. The red silk two-piece dress that we have here has a very full pouched front, which would have been called a mono bosom, and it was worn around 1903. The skirt is separate. It's got some machine-made lace trim. It's got a lot of tucking, pin tucking. So all these garments were probably handmade, so hand-stitched and machine-stitched, except possibly the green and brown one that I said was very early. Because of course sewing machines were not invented until late 1840s, around 1849, and so that garment I don't believe was around, but these other things were made after that, so that they're probably good examples of what was happening at that period with hand and machine stitching. The two dollies here sitting in Elvira's rocker are quite different. One, the one on the right, in fact, I believe is much older. She's got a porcelain face, and she has leather, I think she had leather, certainly her shoes are leather, but something else was leather about her too. And then this dolly has a 20th century face, but her legs and her underpinnings are quite different. They're soft, and yeah, kind of interesting. They're, the one on the right is an Armand Marseille doll. I'm not sure what the one on the left is. So before we go by, we want to look at this photograph, which is a photograph of Elvira on the left and her sister Esther. And in fact, they're wearing some of the clothing, which I don't recommend, in the exhibit. You can see that Esther on the right is wearing that brown top with the little brown dots with the fuzz in the middle, and she's wearing a bonnet that we're going to see in the other room. And Esther, or Elvira, is wearing an apron that we're going to see in the other room, and possibly, I think she's wearing one of the bonnets also. So the last things that we have lined up here in this room are aprons. And generally I'd say that they're aprons, they're short aprons, except for the first one. And I think that they were probably worn in the 20th century. They're really fun. They have, each one has its own little detail. This one has got sort of a handkerchief bottom. This one has rickrack. And they're very, very tailored, but in fact they all have some little something that makes them very cute and appealing. The first one is long and probably very utilitarian. Had cross straps in the back. So now we're going to take a little break and go into the next room and see objects which were worn generally at home. So now we're in the second room with garments that were worn at home. This particular garment was probably a wrapper, and it was made earlier in the 19th century, and you can tell that by the fact that the shoulders are dropped, and they made their garments by hand. This is sewed by hand, so strong. They had little bindings that would go around the armscye. This is called the armscye on the sleeve, and it just was a really strong way to keep the sleeve on to the rest of the garment. This is a really cute one, and in fact, it has a little tiny pocket, little tiny watch pocket or something there, which is sort of coming off. Buttons all the way down the front, so it was easy to get in and out of, and it has a wonderful back fullness in the skirt, so that it was just very comfortable to wear. The next garment is another one of those aprons, which was worn over whatever was being worn at home at that time. This is a crinkled cotton blouse top, and underneath is a very simple petticoat that was worn under other garments. It's cute though, it's got this plaid pattern. So this was worn to protect, it was sort of a pinafore, and it protected the woman's clothing, whatever she happened to be doing in the house or in the yard, in the garden. The next group of objects is a group of aprons, which demonstrate, every single one of them is decorated with a different trim. Somebody just was so talented with their needle and thread, and I'm not sure whether or not this is an example of crochet filet or some other work, but every single one is different, and you really need to look at them very closely. The unfortunate thing about this group of aprons is that, in fact, they were stored poorly, and this is a suggestion to all of you people who like to store vintage clothing. They're very stained, and it's because they were in some kind of an environment that was very acidic, and also it was very vulnerable to animals nesting, because some of them have stains from animals, some of them have stains, they're yellowed, or they have stains just from being in a brown cardboard paper box, which is probably the worst thing you could store something in. If you want to store things, especially cotton and linen things, you should store them in acid-free materials. You can find them online, or even a very clean white sheet wrapped around them and then put in a drawer or in a trunk. The white sheet will protect them. So that's the end of that lecture. The next group we have are two very interesting, actually three wonderful corsets, which it's hard to know exactly when they were made and when they were worn. They're also called stays, and this one has leather trim, and it would have been worn this way because this is sort of a fake busk, which was something that they wore in the front of their dresses and their gowns to keep their stomachs in, I guess. And it's lined, you can see it's all hand stitched. Would have been very difficult to stitch too, because it's got bones, and the bones may very well have been made of baleen, whalebone. Here's another one, which is a little bit more complicated in shape. Again, worn this way, not particularly comfortable. And then the third one is, oh, excuse me, it's very cute actually, the way it's green with a checkered trim. But again, it's lots and lots of rows of bones, and it's laced up the back. So you can sort of see the shape that was the goal for the woman who wore it. Now, one thing that I'd like to point out is that we have something here called a bust enhancer, which was worn by someone probably just tucked in to the top of the corset or the stay. It could have also been tucked in inside the chemise. Now this is a chemise, that is a chemise. The chemise is an undergarment that was worn under everything, and it was often slept in. It was underwear, it was nightie, it was whatever it needed to be, and it was usually a pretty loose garment. This is a pretty old one, the one that's hanging, and you can see that it's really made with a flat pattern with gussets under the arms so that you could raise your arm. And this one is probably a little bit later. It has some trim on it, which probably was made by machine. This garment also has a tournure, which is sort of a simulated way to give some back fullness, because in the 19th century a lot of ladies wore bustles and had back fullness in their skirts. In the 1850s, people started wearing hoops. And we have one hanging here. I'm not going to take it off the wall because it's very fragile. But the hoop sort of replaced layers and layers of petticoats, which were actually quite heavy and hot. And this particular hoop is metal, and probably most of them were metal or wood. And they were a lighter thing, but of course they created bulk that made it very interesting when a woman sat down. There are lots of cartoons that you can find showing women sitting down with their hoops and their skirts going up and all sorts of funny things happening. And then we have a bustle here, which is the same sort of thing as a fabric bustle that would have been worn in the back of a dress. This one is metal and leather. And again, it looks a little like a piece of armor. I'm not exactly sure that it's something that we 21st century people would want to wear. This is the hat closet. First of all, we have two absolutely wonderful hat boxes, which were covered probably with scraps of wallpaper and stored in people's closets, just the way we've stored them here. These bonnets on this shelf, and I'm not quite sure what kind of shelf this was, but we're using it for our display. The first bonnet is a really wonderful little gingham check sunbonnet, and it has all sorts of ties and has a tie in the back too. And this could have been worn when a young woman was working in the field. Very important, because again, they didn't really want to get too much sunburn, and we know today that we're not supposed to get too much sunburn. The next one is a calash, which was worn in the late 18th and early 19th century. And this one is made out of a cotton canvas or a linen, maybe it's a linen. It has a wire frame which makes it collapse, but it was worn as a protective hat over another hat, over a big fancy hairdo, in the bad weather. You'll see them in a variety of collections where they're made in different fabrics, but they were generally worn as a protective garment. This is one of my most favorites. It's a poke bonnet. It's just gorgeous. It's very fine straw. It has a chintz edging and beautiful satin ribbon on it. And this was probably worn early in the 19th century. And again, it has that shape where it's protecting your face from the sun. This is a fun hat. This is very, very flat. Again, early 19th century. It's loaded with trim. Unfortunately, it's not in great condition, but it is, it's just, a very neat kind of thing. You kind of wonder how somebody wore it, but they wore it, and they must have had lots of big hat pins to hold it on their head. This bonnet is a little bit later. It's probably in the mid-19th century. It too has beautiful trim. I mean, they had wide silk ribbons with wonderful colors. It's probably fairly late in the century, because this to me looks like it's machine-made lace. But they were making machine-made lace in the late 19th century. This bonnet is, again, absolutely gorgeous trim. It's just a little piece of netting that's been shaped with a wire frame. A lot of these have wire frames. And again, beautiful ribbon trim. This is probably in the middle of the 19th century. And then we have a little beret, which is very jaunty and plaid, probably from the late 19th century. And another bonnet which has great trim on it, and probably from the 1860s. Then also these two down here, this is another sunbonnet, which is very, very simple. Just made with a gather in the back and some ties sewed on. Probably earlier than the previous sunbonnet. And then this is a wonderful straw, again, very fine straw, that's been woven with some wire to give it strength and shape. But it's a very fancy weave. And that is probably mid-century also. So people were, they made a lot of terrific things by hand. A lot of these things were not made by machine. And there were lots of ladies who made bonnets. That was their business. We have two examples of more handwork. This is a kind of an Afghan, light Afghan. And then this is a really wonderful knitted patchwork with three-dimensional leaves and things on it. So, thank you for watching.